If you ask most mechanical keyboard enthusiasts who joined this hobby in the last 2 or 3 years if they like clicky switches, there's a good chance the answer will be a resounding no! But if you ask people who are in this hobby for a bit longer, much longer in fact, you might get a different answer. While they still probably hate Cherry MX Blues and all its clones that employ the same click jacket mechanism, these old-school mechanical keyboard users and collectors seem to have a special place in their hearts for different types of clicky switches that sound very different from Cherry MX Blues. IBM buckling springs and Alps SKCM switches. While they hate this, they probably love this. With that in mind, the fine folks at Zeal PC, known for their ultra-premium Cherry MX clones such as Zealios, Stelios, and Xylens among others, decided to release a new clicky switch that instead of using the dreadful click jacket from Cherry or even the more acceptable click bar from Kailh, uses a click leaf design that is very similar to those employed in old-school Alps SKCM blue, amber, and white switches. So today we're going to take a look at these brand new switches from Zeal and test them within the retro-inspired NCR-80 keyboard kit to see how similar they can feel and sound to the original Alps switches of the 1980s and 90s, and if they are worth their incredibly high price for anyone who happens to be nostalgic for the sound of those big, heavy, and loud mechanical keyboards of past decades. Sit tight, grab your push pops and giggles cookies, and let's see if a mix of Zeal Clickiez with old-style large plastic keyboard kits can indeed bring back the magic from those vintage clicky mechanical keyboards back. This video is sponsored by PCBWay. Bring your DIY projects to life with PCBWay's printed circuit boards, prototyping, manufacturing, and assembly, as well as their CNC machining and 3D printing services. Check the link in the description below for more information. Hello and welcome to IOSam. I'm Sam Franco, and this is a channel where I do tech reviews and show you how to build, fix, and mod all sorts of computer gear. Today we are checking out Zeal PC's long-awaited clicky switches, and then installing them in a new, but with very old style, keyboard kit I got from Taobao, the NCR-80 TKL, to see if we can make a brand new custom keyboard in 2022 produce those low-frequency thonky and guttural sounds of vintage 80s and 90s keyboards outfitted with Alps SKCM switches. As my regular viewers already know, I break my videos into chapters with progress bars on the bottom and top of the screen to help you navigate through my video in case you want to jump to any specific chapter. As a disclaimer, I bought the Clickiez and the NCR-80 with my own money, but regardless of how I get the products I review on this channel, you should know that it doesn't change my views and opinions, which are and will always be free from any influence from manufacturers, resellers, or PR teams. I will place links for everything you see in this video in the description below, and some of those are affiliate links that will not cost you extra to use, but that might result in a small commission to this channel. The Zeal PC Clickiez is a Cherry MX style switch, meaning it can be installed in any keyboard that accepts 5-pins Cherry MX compatible switches and accepts the same cross-shaped mounted keycaps, but that uses mostly different parts from Cherry MX in its internal design, such as its click metal leaf to produce its tactility and actuation sound. Unlike the ubiquitous Cherry MX Blue that uses a bump in the stem legs to produce tactility and a plastic click jacket that slams against buffer stops in the stem to generate a click sound, the Clickiez use a get-on-cap style linear stem with no bumps, and then uses a metal leaf with teeth that produce tactility and that also generates a click sound when it slams against the wall of the switch when actuated. As for the get-on-cap style stem, that basically means that the pole and well are reversed when compared to regular MX switches. The pole is now in the switch's bottom housing and the well is in the stem. This supposedly gives more stability to the switch actuation, producing a bit less wobble. While the metal click leaf idea is mostly a new design for a Cherry MX compatible clicky switch, the concept actually dates back to the 80s, when it was made popular in Japanese Alps electric SKCM switches used in many popular mechanical keyboards of the time, such as this leading-edge DC 2014, sporting Alps SKCM blue switches, and this Wang 725-7951 with Alps SKCM whites in it. Both are clicky switches using the same type of metal click leaf that slams against the back wall of the switch to generate its actuation click sound. It is also relevant to point out that there was another extremely rare Cherry MX compatible clicky switch in the 80s called Pro World that used a very similar design to the Zeal's Clickiez. They had the same type of click leaf to produce the click sound and its tactility. But those were so rare and obscure that very few people had the chance to even try a single Pro World switch, much less to type on a full keyboard outfitted with them. So, the Alps SKCMs and its clones are by far the most popular clicky switches to ever use a click leaf design, and are the ones we'll be comparing to the Zeal Clickiez in this video. If you're watching this video, I take a wild guess you're into custom keyboards, right? So, if you ever decide to go from a keyboard consumer to a keyboard designer, you might want to check out PCBWay's prototyping, manufacturing, and assembly of PCBs, as well as their CNC machining and 3D printing services you might need to produce keyboard cases and plates. Regardless if you need to produce just a few PCBs or even a single prototype board, PCBWay is a one-stop shop that covers everything you need from PCB fabrication to assembly. And if you're a small business in need of more advanced PCB manufacturing techniques, PCBWay has you covered. They offer a wide variety of custom options for your project, as well as some of the most sophisticated PCB manufacturing options in the market, such as multi-layer, high-density interconnect, flexible and rigid flex boards, thick GEMs, and SMD stenciling. All built within short turnaround times and with the highest quality materials, sourced from the most trusted suppliers in the industry. Check the video description below for more information and for $5 off your first order. And huge thanks to PCBWay for sponsoring this video and for supporting the keyboard hobbyist community. One of the main characteristics of the Zeal Clickiez is the fact that by moving or removing the click leaf, you can change it from clicky to tactile or to linear respectively, which is quite a novel concept in the mechanical keyboards world. The click leaf comes in a straight up position by default that allows it to move back and forth and then hit the back of the switch wall when the stem pushes against the tactile teeth, springing the whole metal leaf backwards, and thus generating the click sound. Now, if you move the click leaf to the other more forward position slot, you now have the leaf in a reclined position where it can no longer slam against the switch's back wall. So in this position, you get a non-clicky tactile switch. You also get the tactile teeth in an even steeper angle, increasing the force required by the stem to overcome the tactile bump, and thus making it even more tactile than in the default clicky configuration. And finally, if you remove the click leaf completely, the switch becomes now a linear switch, since both the click sound and the tactility are caused by the metal click leaf and not by the stem legs, as in any other more traditional Cherry MX design. Now, the main focus of this video will be to test the sound and typing feel of the switch in its default clicky configuration, since my goal here is to see if I can emulate the sound and feel of vintage Alps clicky keyboards. Besides, I have to admit that I really dislike the tactile mode of this switch for being way too steep for my taste. If good tactile MX switches is what you're after, just go with the much cheaper and better Gazoo Boba U4Ts for literally half the price. And for the linear mode, while it's not bad, it just makes no sense to buy these switches to use them as linears. They're simply too expensive for that. You'd be better off buying the significantly cheaper Gateron cap switches that have the same basic design minus the click leaf. So while I wouldn't call the 3-in-1 aspect of this switch a gimmick, I'd say that the tactile mode is a novelty and the linear mode is just a checkbox feature. Trust me, you're not paying the Clickiez premium price for these two optional modes. If you want to see a super in-depth analysis of the switch and all its configurations, then you should definitely check Thomas Rand's review of the Zeal Clickiez in his Kairos Rand 22 channel, that I'll leave a link for it in the description below. Over on his review, Thomas goes really in-depth in comparing its specs with other vintage and modern switches. I'll also leave a link to the written review by Theramine Goat, where you'll have all the specs, force curves, comparisons, and a bunch of other useful information. Definitely worth to check both of these if you want to nerd out on the nitty-gritty of the Zeal switch design. The tactility of the Clickiez is supposed to be one of its main differentiation points, since Zeal promises that these switches were designed to be more tactile than Toper switches modified with BKE domes. And for those who know what that means, it basically means the tactility of the Clickiez is completely bonkers. When compared to clicky Alps SKCM switches, for example, the Clickiez are on a completely different level. In its clicky default configuration, the tactile bump starts rounded with almost no pre-travel, but then becomes insanely sharp once you trigger the click leaf, and its 30 to 40 grams drop feels like free falling all the way down to the bottom. Then, on the tactile modded configuration, you can see that the tactile bump becomes slightly more rounded now, since you no longer have the shearing force caused by the click leaf springing backwards and hitting the switch housing. But this is also where the peak force insanity goes to infinity and beyond. It goes over 100 grams of peak force with an incredible 70 grams drop. But regardless of which mode you use with the click leaf in place, it is basically impossible to actuate this switch without bottoming out, since the force curve of switches with this design offer very little resistance after you overcome the tactile bump. And then there is the issue of the angle the click leaf tactile teeth of the Clickiez have, which is far more aggressive than those on Alps SKCM switches. So the lesser tactility of the Alps could be considered an advantage depending on your taste for switch tactility, since the Clickiez, in their 40 grams bottom mount variety I have here, can feel excessively tactile in its stock unlubed form, at least for my taste. Zeal claims this switch has 73 grams of peak force that happens right before the click, 32 grams actuation force, and then 40 grams after that, which is where you'll bottom out. The tactile bump definitely offers much more resistance than basically any other super tactile Cherry MX style switch I have ever tried, such as Holy Pandas or Gazoo Bobas, for example. And the same is true when compared to other MX clicky switches such as Cherry MX Blues and Kailh BOX Whites. So, in order to rein in the tactility of these switches a bit, I had to lube the tactile teeth of the click leaves, as we'll see on the modding chapter, and that worked well to bring it down to a more usable level for my taste. The stem wobble of the Clickiez is relatively small in any direction, as you'd expect for a switch with a get-around-cap design. Now, while stem wobble is not something I particularly care too much about, and which I even wrote an article in my blog explaining why I usually don't pay too much attention to it, which I'll leave a link to it in the description below, I can see why Zeal chose the get-around-cap style of reverse stem pole design here. Clicky switches in general always give a bit more of a rattly sensation when typing, because of the higher count of moving parts they usually have in them. Cherry MX Blues, for example, are known to rattle a lot, because of how loose its click jacket is. So much, in fact, that you can actually isolate the rattle just by shaking the switch with the stem depressed. Something that does not happen with the Zeal Clickiez or with any of the Kailh BOX Clicky switches, for example. Reducing the stem wobble here was a way to keep the potential rattle to the absolute minimum. And I have to admit that the Clickiez feel way more solid when typing, especially after I lube them, than any other clicky switch I have ever used before. While you'll always get a bit more wobble with tall keycap profiles such as SA, MT3, or CAT, you shouldn't have any major problems in that regard, not even with these types of tall keycaps here. The sound aspect of the switch is, together with its tactility, one of the main reasons why you want to try it, of course. But as I explained in this video's introduction, that will probably only be the case if you happen to be nostalgic about the sound of vintage clicky mechanical keyboards. From a bygone era when most people were still migrating from super loud typewriters and expected an equally loud auditory feedback from each key actuation on their new computer keyboards as well. And while you decide for yourself, during the typing sound test chapter, if you think the sound of this switch is something you'd appreciate, I do have a few important observations about it that I'll go over now. The first thing I noticed with this switch is that its click noise is of a lower pitch variety. In other words, completely different from those click jacket style switches such as Cherry MX Blues and its clones. And that is a huge deal, because the high-pitched rattly sound of MX Blues is what puts off so many typists out there, including myself. The second is that Zeal did a fantastic job in the switch design and materials in regards to ping noise. There is basically none to speak of, which is quite an achievement in and of itself. And the third thing is, of course, these switches can get much louder if you happen to use them in a plastic case with lots of empty space, as I'm doing here with the retro-inspired NCR-80. So if you use these switches in a modern heavy metal hot swap keyboard, such as a GMMK Pro for example, you'll get less noise out of these switches. You still get the clicks, of course, but you lose most of the low frequency growl that these switches can give if you place them on an old style keyboard case. Now for the keyboard kit we used for this project, the NCR-80 TKL. The NCR-80 is an interesting beast for many reasons. It is not a premium custom kit in any way. In fact, one could argue that it is quite the opposite of that. It is a relatively inexpensive injection molded ABS plastic keyboard that you can only get in China for around $85 on Taobao, and that you can get with either a solder or a hot swap PCB and with or without a plate. I went with the hot swap PCB with the carbon fiber plate. The design here is basically a modern recreation of the classic plateless Cherry G80 mixed with the looks of the G81. The G80 used traditional Cherry MX switches, while the G81 had a nice looking industrial grade top cover that the NCR-80 tries to emulate, but used the cheaper and much reviled Cherry MY switches. The NCR designation here is a specific reference to the G81-3077 model that Cherry used to make in the 1980s for NCR, the American computer company specialized in ATMs and point-of-sale machines. While Cherry never made a TKL version of the G80 or the G81, the designers of this clone board took the creative liberty to chop off the numpad to create this super sharp and retro-looking 10 keyless. Now, while this keyboard kit apparently doesn't have any distinctive qualities other than its cool-looking retro style, there was one very specific reason why I picked it for this build. It has two things in common with all those vintage Alps keyboards of the 80s and 90s: the plastic construction and the huge amount of empty space inside the case that ends up working as a resonance chamber, responsible for a lot of the sound of those old-school keyboards. And here I have to give credit to Thomas Wren again for actually calling my attention to that aspect of those vintage boards. About 3 years ago, he posted a video about what many vintage mechanical keyboard collectors, including myself, a proud owner of one of these bad boys, consider to be one of the best-sounding clicky Alps keyboards of all time: the Leading Edge DC 2014, an XT-inspired layout keyboard that was produced by Alps Electric in South Korea during the 80s for Daewoo, which in turn supplied it to the American PC clone maker Leading Edge. In that video, he makes the point that roomy plastic cases mate very well with blue Alps switches.
Another advantage of having a roomy plastic case is that it really brings out the sound of Alps switches, and this being blue Alps, that means it sounds absolutely finger-licking amazing. Honestly, this has to be one of the best sounding Alps chassis I've heard to date. It's spectacular.
I thought that was indeed an excellent point, since as we all know by now, empty spaces within keyboards do amplify the sounds coming out of the switches, although it can also amplify pings, rattles, and other annoying sounds, especially in modern production keyboards that many times have looser manufacturing tolerances than these behemoths made in the 80s. At any rate, I thought the NCR-80 would be a perfect candidate to test Thomas' theory of why these old blue Alps keyboards sound so good. While this keyboard kit is not the main star of the show here, the Zeal Clickiez are, let's just go through the basics of the NCR-80 and its build quality and design. The case is made of pretty thick ABS injection molded plastic, which is quite nice, and feels pretty hefty in your hands. My copy has this two-tone design with the top half in this industrial gray, which is more like an olive drab color, and the bottom half in beige. But I know you can get this kit in full beige, where both top and bottom halves come in the same color. Now, the finishing is where this keyboard leaves a lot to be desired. The thing that really annoyed me here are these weird machining smudge marks on the keyboard's forehead that are quite visible depending on the angle the light hits it. And as far as I could see in many other videos about this keyboard, all NCR-80s have this issue, so it seems it might be a problem with the injection mold used here. At any rate, I found a way to fix this problem by simply painting the top half of the case, as we'll see in the modding chapter. On the inside, we thankfully get metal threaded inserts for the screws, which is always nice. On the bottom, you have one level of height adjustment. The retractable feet seem a bit on the flimsy side. But since I like the 5 degrees angle the keyboard has in its flat position, I don't intend to use the retractable feet anyway. Another issue here were the super thin rubber feet that did a very poor job of holding the keyboard in place on my desk, which I fixed by applying some extra silicone bumpers on the bottom. The hot swap PCB was surprisingly good. Although even with the hot swap option, you still need to solder the 3 status LEDs which are included in the package. While it doesn't have any extras such as backlighting or wireless connectivity, the board at least has QMK and VIA compatibility, and it seems well built, with Kailh hot swap sockets and flex cuts in all the right places. This PCB attaches directly to the bottom case in a tray mount style, which means it can be used without a plate in the solder version if you decide to go that route. I placed some O-rings between the PCB and the bottom case just to try to soften up the bottom out a little bit and eliminate any friction points between hard parts. And you obviously need the plate if you get the hot swap version as I did here. It connects to an USB-C daughter board through a JST connector and exiting on the right side, as most traditional TKLs usually do. This board offers software programmability through QMK and VIA, although the VIA implementation here is not exactly the easiest, since you need to either create your own JSON file or get one provided by the folks at YMDK that I'll leave a link for it in the description below, before VIA will even recognize this keyboard. Another issue I had when trying to use it with VIA is that every time I try to reprogram something on this board, when opening VIA, it would no longer recognize the NCR-80. and the only way to make it see the keyboard again was to reload the YMDK provided standard JSON file. It wouldn't work with the one I saved with my own layout. Although at least that would not mess up my previous layout configuration of the board, that luckily was still there after all this process. But all things considered, I'll still take a flaky VIA implementation over any other proprietary software interface out there any day of the week. So I'm not gonna complain too much about it here. Now, on the really negative side, the controller does not offer N-key rollover. The maximum number of simultaneous actuations here is 6 keys, which can get up to 9 if you include certain modifier keys. That's more than enough for typing and casual gaming, but certainly not for competitive titles. The kit doesn't come with any type of sound damping material, but considering the nature of my particular project here, I wouldn't use one anyway. But for people who want to use this board just for the looks and are not trying to evoke the loud sounds of vintage clicky switches, you have plenty of space to add foam under the PCB here if you want to. The optional plate is made of carbon fiber and it is very nice, although the included screws were not long enough to reach the spacers on the other side of the PCB, which sucks. In the end, I had to use other plate PCB screws I had laying around here, which were leftovers from both the TKC Portico and the KBD Fans KBD67 Lite, which thankfully came with extra screws that fitted the NCR-80 plate spacers perfectly. The kit does not come with any stabs, so here I used Durock V1s I had laying around, which are always very good. I lubed the housings and stamps with my usual mix of half and half Krytox 205 grade 2 and 105 oil, and the wires tips with Krytox XHT BDZ. The NCR-80 kit comes partially assembled with tape instead of screws, but that is just to protect the parts from moving inside the box, since the kit itself is not super well packed as you can see here. As previously mentioned, you need a soldering iron if you want to use the 3 LED status lights that come in the package. Here, I use my trusty Hakko FX 888D and a Zytronic 426DLX fume extractor for the job. Just apply some flux, solder the through-hole legs of the LED lights, ensuring the longer leg goes into the hole with the plus sign, and then cut off the excess wires. Pretty basic soldering job here really. While moving the PCB around, one of the wires of the JST connector came loose and I had to reinsert it back into the plastic plug. Then I applied some hot glue where the wires meet the plastic connector, just to ensure they wouldn't come loose again later. I then moved on to put the 6x2mm O-rings with a bit of glue stick on top of the screw posts, just to ensure they wouldn't fall off during assembly. Then was time to lube the stabs housings and stamps with my Krytox mix, which is equivalent to grade 0, and the wires tips with the extra thick XHT BDZ, and then screw them using washers between the screws and the PCB. As usual, the Wowstick was heavily used in this project to speed up the whole assembly. Link for it in the description below. Next step was to attach the plate to the PCB. For that, you need to use the spacers that you screw from both the PCB and the plate sides with the provided screws. But here's where I found out the provided screws worked on the plate side, but not on the PCB side. The PCB is too thick for the tiny screws to reach the spacer on the other side. Luckily for me, I had 6 longer extra screws from my Portico and my KBD67 Lite that I could use here. So that shows the level of QC that you can expect when getting this kit from Taobao. Then, I plugged the JST cable between the USB-C daughter board that already comes screwed to the case and the main PCB, and then placed the PCB on top of the bottom half of the case and try to screw it through the O-rings. That's when I found out that the 2mm thick O-rings I was trying to use here were also too thick for the provided screws. So I replaced them for smaller 4x1mm O-rings that I placed them around the screws and then attached everything to the case. While these 1mm thick O-rings will not give you much perceived softness, they will isolate the PCB from the case, which will help in reducing vibrations and hard materials from rubbing against each other and producing unwanted noises. And the final step? Use 3 long and 3 short screws from the bottom to attach both halves of the case together. The keyboard measures 38.2 centimeters in width, 19.5 centimeters in depth, 1.8 centimeters in the beveled front side, 4 centimeters in height on the back side on the flat position, and 5.7 centimeters with the feet extended. The inclination angles are either mild 5 or a very aggressive 12 degrees when measured on top of the 3rd row of cherry profile keycaps. The fully assembled NCR-80 weighs 1.42 kilograms or 2 pounds and 4.7 ounces with switches and PBT keycaps. The looks are always a subjective matter and 100% based on personal opinion, of course. But with that disclaimer out of the way, yeah, of course I love the way this thing looks. I'm a retro computing enthusiast, so most of these throwback 80s and 90s keyboard designs will appeal to me. Having said that, the giant forehead of this keyboard is not very practical, of course. This thing takes a huge amount of space in my desk. So while I can see myself whipping out this board for long typing sessions, such as script writing, it is too big for my setup when I'm editing videos, for example. For the first sound test, I tried the Zeal Clickiez in stock form in the NCR-80 assembled with Lubed Durock V1 stabs and with Drop's MiTo DCD Pegaso keycap set in the MiTo corn color scheme that I got on one of Drop's weekend sales for $59 plus shipping and taxes. The set is die-sub PBT in this very appropriate retro beige color with red and blue fonts for the mods. Different font colors on modifier keys is also something we used to get in vintage keyboards of the early 90s, so that was also a nice touch in my retro-inspired build here. This set uses a super smooth PBT blend. It is very thick, which is good to help dampen the excessive noise out of clicky switches, and has bold and well-aligned fonts. Oh, and the space bar is also PBT and came perfectly straight. No banana space bar here, which is good of course. To complement the kit, I'm using a Ducky TKL leather wrist rest with red stitching I got from mechanicalkeyboards.com for $34, which is super comfortable and matches the NCR-80 pretty well in my opinion. Alright, so let's hear how the Zeal PC Clickiez sound in stock form with the spacious ABS plastic case of the NCR-80 keyboard kit. First, yeah, it's loud. At an average of 57.6 decibels, I'd say this board is around 10 decibels louder than your average mechanical keyboard with linear switches, for example. But sound volume aside, it has a far lower pitch noise than what you get from Cherry MX Blues, for example, and you also get pretty much no ping. And these are two very important things in any switch sound, especially in clicky switches. But my favorite thing about this build sound, though, is the space bar. It sounds like Godzilla is stomping the ground. I love it. To illustrate the differences of the Zeal Clickiez with other clicky switches, let's start by comparing it to a classic Philco Magis Touch TKL outfitted with Cherry MX Blues. First, the Cherry MX Blues are louder than the Zeal Clickiez, about 2 decibels when compared to the stock Zeals. And then we can clearly hear how much deeper the sound of the Clickiez is on this plastic old school NCR-80 when compared to the cherries on the Philco. Even on a relatively old school roomy plastic chassis itself, such as the Philco Magis Touch, the Cherry MX Blues still sounds much higher pitch and much rattlier. So in my opinion, in terms of sound, there's really no competition here. The Zeal Clickiez sound far better and much more pleasant than Cherry MX Blues. Now, typing feel is a more complicated matter since the tactility of the MX Blue is much better behaved than that of the stock Zeal Clickiez. But not even that gives the Cherry the upper hand here in my opinion, simply because of how rattly it feels when compared to the super solid Zeal. But yeah, beating Cherry MX Blues is not exactly a high bar, right? In my opinion, Kailh had already beat Cherry on the clicky switch department a long time ago when they developed the box switches with click bars instead of Cherry's click jacket. Kailh BOX Clickiez switches feel and sound better than any Cherry MX Blue or similar clones anyway. But I have to say the Zeal Clickiez definitely stole the position of better sounding clicky switch from the Kailh BOX Whites in my opinion, which had been until now my favorite MX compatible clicky switch. Check out the comparison between the Zeal Clickiez and the Box Whites on the NCR-80. Here, I'd say the story is a bit different than with the Cherry MX Blue comparison, since the Kailh Box definitely sounds better than the Cherries. Although one big disadvantage with the Kailhs in my opinion is the fact that unlike with the Cherry or the Zeals, the switch clicks twice when pressed, one on the downstroke and one on the upstroke, which while not increasing the loudness, it is in fact quieter than the stock Zeals, it does increase the annoyance factor with the double clicks on every key press. Besides, the Kailhs also sound much higher pitched than the Zeals. So in the sound department, neither the Kailhs can beat the Zeal Clickiez, even when also installed on a roomy plastic case. At any rate, the main point here was to see if we could build a modern keyboard that should feel and sound as good as vintage classic boards with the much beloved buckling springs and Alps SKCM clicky switches. So let's then hear a comparison between the NCR-80 with Zeal Clickiez and 3 old school keyboards. One outfitted with buckling springs, the Unicomp Mini M in the TKL layout I got brand new directly from Unicomp early last year, which is a recreation of the iconic IBM Model M SSK. And 2 Alps SKCM based ones, the Wang 725-7951 with white Alps and the legendary leading edge DC 2014 with blue Alps. Well, in terms of loudness, they are pretty much equivalent, all of them averaging around 57 decibels, with the Mini M being the outlier at 60 dBs. In terms of the overall quality of the sound, the new keyboard has a huge advantage here, with its Lubed Durock stabs that have no rattle, while the other boards are all stock with their old school rattly stabs. But discounting the stabs noises, I'd say the Clickiez in the NCR-80 actually sound deeper than both Alps boards we tried here, and definitely deeper than the Unicomp buckling springs. Buckling springs feel amazing to type on, since their tactility is perfectly weighted and balanced, but it can sound very metallic and pingy, which you can fix if you lube their springs, as I'll show in my upcoming review of this board. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. The NCR-80 with Clickiez also definitely sound deeper than the white Alps on the Wang, and ever so slightly deeper than the leading edge. So the fact that this build can sound as deep and as good as the leading edge DC 2014 already means I succeeded in my experiment here. at least in the sound department, since the DC 2014 has been my favorite sounding Alps SKCM board of all time, and I now can replicate that sound with a new keyboard using new switches. Now, sound is just half of the equation, of course. The other half is typing feel. And in that area, the buckling springs and the Alps switches still feel better than the Clickiez simply because they have a more balanced tactility, while the Clickiez are a bit overbearing in that regard in my opinion. So if Zeal ever releases a lighter version of the switch, I think they'll definitely hit it out of the park, since you then have a super nice sounding Clickiez switch with a comfortable level of tactility that will not feel fatiguing after a long typing session. So the question then becomes, can we mod the Clickiez to reduce its tactility and thus achieving a more comfortable typing feel? Well, yes. For one, you could try to bend the clicky leaf tactile teeth to a slightly wider angle, which would thus reduce the tactility somewhat. But the problem with this mod would be consistency, since it would be borderline impossible to bend the two tiny tactile teeth of every single one of the 80 switches used here in the same exact angle. So there has to be another easier way. And it turns out there is. Remember how most keyboard content creators out there always tell you to
never lube the stem legs and the leaf spring of tactile switches, or you'll turn them into linears, and your soul will forever burn in the tactile switches' heretic hell.
Well, considering that we're actually trying to reduce the excessive tactility of the switch here, that might be exactly the solution we were looking for. But the thing here is that the Zeal Clickiez don't have any tactile bumps in the stem legs, which are completely linear. So my idea was to then lube the click leaf teeth that gives the switches its tactility. And while in there, also lube the housing rails and the long spring to reduce whatever ping noise could still come out of the switch. When reassembling the switch, be careful not to damage the click leaf when closing the switch. Make sure it is not caught between the two halves of the switch housing before you snap them together. Ask me how I know. So here I went repeating this process 80 times for this TKL. And I can say that just from testing the switch in isolation, I could already notice a slight reduction in the switch's tactility. The reduction was smaller than I wanted, but it was noticeable, so I had high hopes that it would improve the typing feel of my build. On the NCR-80, aside from the extra bumpers I installed in the bottom of the keyboard to ensure it wouldn't slide in my desk, and the 4x1mm O-rings I placed between the PCB and the bottom case, there was only one big modification I wanted to try: painting the top case to get rid of those ugly injection molding defects and maybe imprint some additional personality to this project. And I'll admit that this is not something I had ever tried before, so here I basically followed Tay Keyboard's excellent keyboard painting guide that I'll leave a link for in the description below. I'll say this, it was a much longer process than I was expecting, and the main reason for that was how bad the NCR-80's case injection molding really is. There were little depressions and bumps all over the surface that made my life miserable when prepping it for painting. First, I taped the areas I didn't want any paint on, such as the logo and the status lights. I thought about trying to remove those, but I figured I could end up damaging them in the process, so I decided to do a very careful taping instead. Then I did a good sanding of the case with 400 grit paper while spraying it with soapy water. While the NC-80's case is already textured, the sanding process here helped in two ways: to remove any oils or pre-existing coatings that could make it difficult for the prime coat to adhere, and to try to smooth out some of the bumps in the case's surface that I feared would show up more with the paint I wanted to apply than with its original finish. Then it was time for the priming process, which was the longest and most difficult part. After priming it with 3 good coatings with around 5 minutes of drying in between, it became clear to me that some of the depressions and bumps in the case were so bad that they would require another full sanding of some of the worst parts to try to even out the topography of the surface, such as you can see here on the area around the status lights. After more sanding with 400 grit sandpaper, always washing the whole case after each sanding session, I reapplied another 3 light coatings of prime paint and then left it to dry overnight. On the following day, with the prime paint completely dry, I went back to some more sanding, but with a finer 800 grit this time to try to get a smoother texture before applying the paint. While I was not able to completely smooth out the problematic surface of the top case, it definitely got better, which made my life a lot easier when painting. For the actual paint, I chose this e-coating style of metal spray paint that is targeted at painting guns, in this field drab color that was close to the original color of the top half of the case, but with a touch of tan to it, a mix of green and brown. After carefully washing the case to remove any dust or debris, I did 4 light coatings with about 20 to 30 minutes of drying in between. Yeah, it is a long and drawn-out process. Patience is highly recommended. Oh, and I also recommend you do this on a well-ventilated area of your house, since the fumes from these chemicals are really nasty, and where you're not gonna get grounded for making a mess, because the place will get really dirty. Because I had not been able to completely flatten out the surface, I noticed that the paint was getting a slightly different tonality in the depressions than in the higher parts of the surface, which meant more sanding with 800 grit paper to try to smooth things out a bit more. I ended up having to repeat this process of applying light coating, drying, sanding, and washing for 3 times. That helped to smooth out things as well as eliminate little paint droplets that would fall on the surface. After the last sanding, I applied 2 extra very light coatings with 30 minutes drying in between before I finally got to a point where I was happy with the result. It wasn't perfect, mind you. Getting to a perfect surface would mean keep repeating this paint and fine sanding for God knows how many more hours. But I figured it was good enough to move on to the final phase, the clear coating. Luckily for me, the satin finish coating I picked did a very good job in finally finishing covering whatever little depressions were still present on the surface, especially in the areas around the F-roll and beneath the spacebar. Here I did 3 coatings with 30 minutes of drying in between as well, shining a strong light at it from different angles to help me see if there were any areas that needed an extra pass. After letting everything cure overnight, I could finally remove the tape and reinstall the top case on the keyboard. But it is important to mention that the clear coating was still feeling a bit gummy even after 24 hours. In my experience, the whole thing was not ready for daily use before curing for at least 48 hours. Despite the end result not being perfect, which I didn't expect it to be anyway, it ended up pretty nice for a first try. And here we have the final product. Looking pretty sharp if I may say so myself. The higher contrast and slightly more glossy paint job, if compared to the original color, definitely added some leathery flair to it. And even the little painting flaws and scuffs here and there ended up giving it some personality. And I love that about this finished build. So, let's check out how the Lubed Zeal Clickiez sound on the now painted NCR-80. Alright, the difference in sound was not huge. It is there, a tiny notch lower frequency and smoother sound, but not immediately perceptible. The bigger and more important difference, though, came in the typing feel. Lubing the click leaf had a measurable impact in reducing the excessive tactility of this switch, which in my opinion makes it a better product. It's not that I don't like super tactile switches, I do. Gazoo Bobas and 55 grams Topras are some of my favorite switches, and they are extremely tactile. But the Zeal Clickiez in their 40 grams variety I tried here kind of crosses a line where it just becomes too fatiguing to type on after a while for my taste. So I cannot even imagine what the 75 grams bottom-out version with its 95 grams of peak force will feel like. It might as well be strength training for your fingers. Not only because of the sheer force of the tactile bump you have to overcome to actuate the switch, but also because it is basically impossible to type on these switches without bottoming out hard on every stroke. which will eventually lead to hand and fingers fatigue. So lubing the tactile teeth in the click leaf reduced the tactility by about 10% in my totally subjective perception, which, while still extremely tactile, brings it down enough to cross the line into my tolerable tactility level. Now for a final comparison here, let's just see how the Zeal Clickiez sound in a metal keyboard with a modern design, just to see how that affects the sound of this switch, and to finally be able to conclude if the plastic roomy case of the NCR-80 really improves the sound of these switches or not. And yeah, not surprisingly, the Clickiez lose a lot of their charm in a heavy metal case stuffed with sound damping materials and isolation gaskets. While its click sound is still nicer than Cherry MX Blue and clicky Kailh BOX switches, it loses a lot of the bassy tones we got on the NCR-80, which is what makes that combination so interesting. So, what are my conclusions about the Zeal Clickiez switches and their use in either old-style roomy plastic cases, such as the NCR-80, or in modern damped metal cases such as the GMMK Pro? First, I have to say that, in general, I've reached the same conclusion than Thomas did in his review of these switches. They are the best sounding MX-compatible Clickiez switches in the market today. And I don't think many people will argue this point too much. I think all the different typing, sound tests, and comparisons I did here make a very good case for that. But, and this is a very big but, you only get the full Alps SKCM-like experience out of these switches if you install them in a roomy plastic case, such as the retro-inspired NCR-80 I use here, which immediately becomes a problem in today's market, since we don't have too many options of those that you can easily buy. The NCR-80 itself, with all its QC problems, is fairly difficult to get your hands on in the West, as we'll discuss later in the NCR-80 availability chapter. There is the Zeal Clickiez NK-87 entry edition, which is a polycarbonate build kit, but that is not roomy enough to make too much of a difference in my opinion. One interesting new option that is also plastic and fairly roomy is the brand new Vortex KBT RE68, a super interesting hot swap keyboard that is also heavily retro-inspired by the second generation IBM PC Junior keyboard of the 80s. While the original V2 PC Junior keyboard was not known for being a good keyboard with its cheap rubber domes, I believe Vortex did a fantastic job with the RE68 and their recreation of that board in a hot swap mechanical version. And I can't wait to get my hands on one of these to test the Zeal Clickiez in them. Now, moving on to the other very important aspect of the switch, the typing feel. And here, again, I reached the same conclusion than Thomas. These switches are simply too heavy, even in its lighter 40 grams bottom out and 73 grams peak force. So at least to me, modifying this switch to use it in its non-clicky tactile mode, which increases its tactility even more, would be a non-starter. But lubing the click leaf helped to reduce the peak force enough to make these switches usable to me in their clicky mode. And lubed, I can now say that even though this switch is still way heavier than Cherry MX Blues and Kailh BOX White, the Zeal Clickiez are now my favorite MX-compatible Clickiez switch, simply because of how precise and tight they feel when typed, without the rattle of the Cherry MX Blue and without the double clicks of the Kailh BOX. So while the Cherries and the Kailhs can be less fatiguing based on their force curves, they can get more annoying to type on for longer sessions. I cannot wait for Zeal to release a lighter version of the Clickiez, since that would basically make that the undisputed champion in the modern Clickiez switches segment. On the quality department, say what you will about Zeal and its premium prices, you definitely get good QC with their products. This is my third set of Zeal switches. I have both Xylence and Tilias in two of my boards, and every single batch of their switches I ever got is always extremely consistent in terms of sound and feel, which is a real achievement considering how much variance we should always expect in any given batch of keyboard switches. So you can at least know that the high prices they charge are not only employed in designing good switches that perform well and sound good, but also in knowing that they will be fairly consistent in their typing feel and sound. And on the topic of pricing, yeah, they're expensive. Even in the discounted pre-order phase price of $1.30 each, which will go to $1.50 once the pre-order phase ends, this is already the most expensive MX switch in the market right now. And while the price can be justified in terms of all the research and development Zeal has put into these things, it took them a very long time to develop these switches, and in their top-notch QC, the value argument here gets demolished when compared to the average price, even for premium aftermarket MX switches, which is around 65 cents per unit. So this is, by definition, a luxury product in that regard. And then there's the fact that most new keyboard enthusiasts these days, the people who are potentially more inclined to spend that kind of money on keyboard switches, don't seem to care too much for clicky switches. And the people who do like clicky switches, usually young gamers, are more often than not perfectly happy with cheap Cherry MX Blues. So that creates an interesting problem for Zeal and their main target market for this switch, as we'll discuss in a minute. But if you happen to be someone who always dreamed of having the Alps SKCM type in experience, but were never willing to pay the ridiculously high prices for those vintage Alps-based boards that today are all in the hands of collectors, then the value proposition of the Zeal Clickiez suddenly changed for the better. Since even if you go out of your way, as I did here, to get a retro-style keyboard kit that resembles those vintage mechanical keyboards from the 80s and 90s, and add up the cost of the Clickiez, plus good keycaps and some decent PCB-mounted stabs, you're still likely to spend less money than paying for a collector's vintage Alps keyboard in good condition. And let's not forget that vintage keyboards have all sorts of problems that are inherent to their old tech. Weird layouts, obsolete connections that require expensive adapters, and all sorts of other maintenance ordeals. So the value proposition here really depends on what type of keyboard enthusiast you really are. The availability of Zeal switches has always been pretty good all over the globe. Zeal has plenty of resellers in all continents, so getting your hands on their products is never too much of a problem. Although with the Clickiez in particular, at this moment in 2022, you can only get them directly from Zeal PC's own store, which adds even more to its price if you're not in Canada, since you now have to consider international shipping costs. But if Zeal's past history is any indication, once their pre-ordering phase ends, you should be able to find the Clickiez in any of their usual resellers wherever you are in the world. As we move to the competitive analysis, I'd say the Clickiez are unique enough that if you like what Zeal has done here, you know you don't have many other options to get something that feels and sounds alike. Zeal, for the most part, succeeded in creating a MX-compatible Clickiez switch that sounds and feels more like Alps SKCM than Cherry MX Blue. So unless you're willing to pay the absurd prices both in terms of time and money for collectors' vintage keyboards based on Alps SKCM these days, the Zeal Clickiez is basically your only option. And, as we pretty much established so far, it seems pretty clear that the target market for these switches is a very particular one. People who have been mechanical keyboard enthusiasts for long enough to be able to appreciate what Alps SKCM switches represent in this hobby. You know, people like me, which had their first mechanical keyboard experience in the mid-90s when I first used an Apple AEK2, or Apple Extended Keyboard as the acronym stands for, outfitted with damped green Alps in my first internship office job at a consulting company. In other words, older people in the mechanical keyboards hobby who knows that not all clicky switches are as bad as Cherry MX Blues. If Zeal can convince Gen Xers like me and other early millennials who also had the chance to experiment with Alps-based keyboards in the 90s to pay for the SKCM-like experience the Zeal Clickiez can provide, I think they might sell enough of these to break even. And then we can only hope they're able to bring their prices down a bit in the future to make these things a bit more affordable to the general public who might be curious about super premium clicky switches. As for the NCR-80, while it was not the main star of the show here, it was mostly the best host I could find for these switches, I still have a few things to say about it. First, while its original price is a relatively inexpensive $85 in China, it is not particularly easy to get your hands on one here in the Western Hemisphere. The whole process of using a shipping agent, such as Superbuy in my case, to intermediate the process between you and Taobao can be a bit overwhelming. Not to mention that the Superbuy fee itself will add up another chunk of money to have the NCR-80 shipped to you, depending on where in the world you're based. I have to credit Black Simon for pointing me in the right direction on how to get one of these in his video review of this kit, which I'll leave a link to in the description below if you want to check his excellent in-depth review of the solder version of this kit. And then, all the QC issues you have with the NCR-80 makes its value proposition even more complicated. Poor packaging, bad top case finish, and screws that cannot reach the other side of the PCB to attach the optional plate are just some of its problems. But because of the absolute lack of choice in old-style roomy plastic keyboard kits out there, the NCR-80 ends up being one of the very few options to build a retro-style keyboard with the Zeal Clickiez that will make these switches really shine. As I mentioned before, I'll definitely try to get the new Vortex KBT RE68 or the RE66 to test with these switches. Besides, the Vortex board, with its 65% layout, might be more appealing to a wider audience that seems to flock to smaller form factor kits these days. Let me know in the comments below if this new Vortex board is something you'd be interested in seeing here in the channel. Other than these two kits, your only other option to install the Zeal Clickiez in a roomy plastic case will be repurposing an old Cherry MX based vintage keyboard you might already have laying around. You could even get a brand new Cherry G80-1800 with Cherry MX blacks for around $100 and then modify it with new switches if you happen to be handy with a soldering iron. At any rate, if you go through the trouble to get a NCR-80 and then fixing and modifying it to your liking, like I did with mine, the end result can be a really fun keyboard that you can use to spice things up a bit every once in a while. Preferably when there isn't anyone around to complain about the thunderous noises coming from your keyboard, that is. If you don't feel like going through all this trouble, but still would like to have fun with an old school style clicky keyboard that sounds like a 60s muscle car doing burnouts, the Unicomp Mini M would be another logical choice. A brand new buckling springs TKL from the same makers of the original IBM Model M that has arguably one of the best typing experiences of any clicky keyboard in existence and costs a very reasonable $140 for a complete product with shipping within the US already included for a production keyboard that is ready to go out of the box. It is a bit pingy, but I'll have a video review about it soon showing how you can easily fix that and make one of the best values in production mechanical keyboards out there today with its perfect tactility, awesome die-sub PBT keycaps, and incredibly cool looks even better. While Unicomp is currently sold out of these because of the chip shortage, they will bring it back sometime later this year. So that is definitely a good choice if you want to experiment with something different and arguably better in many aspects to Cherry MX based mechanical keyboards. So, what do you think? Would you consider buying or building an old school clicky keyboard yourself? Does the thonky sound of the Zeal Clickiez enough to convince you to ever use clicky switches? Let me know in the comments below. Any questions? Leave them in the comments as well, and you know I'll be glad to help out. Also, I'll leave a link to my brand new IOSAM subreddit, where you can also drop by and ask me anything about my videos, and I might be able to answer you there even quicker than I usually do here on YouTube. As usual, links for everything in the description below. And in case you missed my recent review of the awesome KBD67 Lite, check it out right here. Or click here to see my head-to-head comparison and modding of two super interesting budget 96% keyboards. Thanks again, and see you all soon.